Greetings and welcome to the Richard Dolan Show, where every week we fight the good fight. Very glad to be here with you, August 27th, 2024. I spent last week reading Luis Elizondo's new book, Imminent, subtitled Inside the Pentagon's Hunt for UFOs. The book was published just about a week ago, August 20th, after a year-long security review by the Pentagon. So I'm going to talk about that book here today. But before I go any further, I just want to disclose a few things. First, I know Luis Elizondo. We've spent some time together. We've had meaningful conversations. We like each other. So I just want to be upfront about that. Since he's become a known public figure in this field, I have supported what he is trying to do, at least as far as I can understand it. That is not to say that I agree with all of his perspectives on the world. I think that I agree with some and maybe not with others. That should be no surprise since he's spent his career working within the United States military system and I haven't. But overall, in terms of what he's had to say publicly about UFOs, or now UAP, essentially he's saying it's real and someone is here. To me, that is something I have always felt as a breath of fresh air in our public discourse. Having said all of that, I'm going to give my most candid thoughts on this book as carefully and honestly as I can. That's a picture of Lou. That is the cover of his book, Imminent. And that's what I'm going to be talking about. I guess I should say first that, 30 years ago when I started researching what was then called ufology, back in the early 1990s, my level of knowledge started at zero. I had no real reference points to start with, so I just dove in to what was then called the literature or the research. And back then, I had one major criterion for what constituted a valuable book. The author's personal opinions about UFOs was not it. That's not the thing I was really interested in. I remember actually not caring almost at all what the writer, him or herself, thought about UFOs. Instead, the only thing that I really cared about is, did the book have factual information that I could put to use into like a clear picture of what happened? Because as we all know, truth can come at you from many different perspectives. And that was always my goal back then. And it has really remained my number one criterion to this day. When I judge a book, whether or not I think it's valuable, that's what it is. Is there information in here that is useful, that can be extracted in order to kind of put together a larger picture? So keep that in mind. Now, while we can discuss opinions in a short while, but the first thing I want to say is that after reading Imminent, that it is an extremely valuable book for the UFO field, or now the UAP field. Historically speaking, there's almost nothing like this book. Perhaps you'd have to go back almost 70 years to find another book by another official U.S. government UFO insider to find something comparable. That would be the 1956 classic by the ex-chief of Project Blue Book. That was U.S. Air Force Captain Edward Ruppelt. If you're going to find something similar, you probably would have to go back that far, I think, to get a book that's similar to what Luis Elizondo has done with Imminent. I'm not sure how to judge, by the way, which of those two books will turn out to be more historically significant. For right now, I would say they're quite comparable. I would say that what Luis Elizondo has done is very much on the level of the very classic book by Edward Ruppelt from 7 decades ago. There is a lot in this book for researchers to take notice of and to unpack. And so for that alone, I would say this book is extremely valuable. So first, a few of the things that I would want to say here is Lou's own background. As most of you know, if you've been connected with the UFO UAP field the last 7 years, unless you've lived under a rock, you will know he is a former senior intelligence official. He was head of the program known as the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. That's AATIP. This was once a secret Pentagon initiative. We're going to talk a little more about it in a second. That was focused on investigating UAP, to put it simply. Elizondo's career in intelligence and counterintelligence, goes several decades. During that time, he served in various capacities, not just UFOs or UAP. He ran several highly classified programs, both for the White House and for the National Security Council. He has an extensive background in advanced aerospace technology, and his work to prevent that type of technology from falling into the wrong hands, basically China, Russia, and all of the other adversaries that the U.S. loves to talk about. His job was to keep those technologies away from them, and you could really see now that laid the foundation for his involvement in AATIP. In the book, and as we already know publicly, he was recruited back in 2009 into AATIP, AAWSAP/AATIP. I'll get into those distinctions in a second. In that capacity, he worked alongside very notable individuals such as James Lukatsky, Jay Stratton. Under their leadership and under Lou's leadership, you really can see the program went deeper into UAP sightings, near misses, other types of encounters, many of which involved Navy jets. And then essentially, despite all of the significant findings of the program, he really highlights in this book how there was so much considerable opposition to the program, but internally particularly in the Pentagon. I'll get into some of those details as well. Excess of secrecy, lack of resources, which ultimately led to his resignation in 2017. So that's basically his background. And then after he left the Pentagon in 2017, you can really see the new chapter in his career, his life, as he goes public, advocating for transparency, disclosure. Frequently, you can hear him make these statements, public awareness, congressional action. It's really not hard to see that his efforts since 2017 have led to many important developments, not alone. He's had a lot of people working with him, of course, but he's been very, very much part of the story. In other words, Luis Elizondo is someone who has had a real historical impact, and this book needs to be understood in the context of that. So what does some of the major points of the book, and there's much more than even what I have listed here in the bullet, but we'll start with this. Fundamentally, he's saying there has been a decades-long UFO UAP crash retrieval program. And by the way, I haven't really asked him this, but I have a feeling, I think in many places, I think he must have written UFO into the book. And I have this feeling that someone at HarperCollins just said, we're going to do search and replace. All UFOs are going to be UAP. Maybe that was Lou's decision. I'll have to ask. But it seems to me that they just went, everything's UAP now. But he has used the phrase UFO frequently. And so it's very interesting where he stands personally on all of that. But in any case, he talks about this, that there's a crash retrieval program. This is a very significant statement by itself. It's one thing for a private researcher, whether it's myself or anyone else who does not have senior clearances within the U.S. government, to make these statements based on our research. But when you have someone, he was a G15 level government employee, he had extensive clearances, and he was directly involved in a UFO UAP program, and he is coming out very bluntly and stating this. That is a significant thing. This is what David Grush, of course, said a year ago. Luis Elizondo himself said this even before David Grush. Back in 2019, Elizondo was on a program with Tucker Carlson, and he made a very, very direct statement to that effect. That was late May of 2019. So he's been very consistent with this, and he has made this very, very explicit in this book. He's also talked about the program, basically the legacy programs to retrieve essentially extraterrestrial technology and biological remains of these beings of non-human origin, a delicate way to say alien. And he's talked about that in other words, we have got their technology and we've got their bodies, essentially. He goes on, he says, humanity is not the only intelligent life in the universe. We're not the alpha species, as he puts it. And then, of course, he makes a statement, and I'm going to come back to this as well, because this is a real trigger point for a lot of people, that the UAP are a genuine potential threat, not just to national security, he says, but really, in a sense, potentially existentially to humanity. as a species. It's a very, very powerful statement. Not everyone in the UFO community likes to hear that. He gets a lot of pushback on that. I will be discussing that before we're done. So anyway, those are the very fundamental points that he makes. I'll just add, I think it's worth stating that there are very few, if any, major, like high-level government individuals with those types of intelligence community credentials that Lou has, who are out there saying anything like this, that UAP are real, that essentially aliens are real and are here. That's basically what he's saying, that we have acquired their technology. You have Christopher Mellon, who wrote the foreword to Imminent, and he does say many comparable things. It's true. But you can see that Mellon's a bit more careful, I would say, a little more guarded in most of his statements along those lines. Lou is much more direct, and he really has always been so since we first started hearing from him in 2017. So that's the beginning of where we're going to start. Let me go on. I've got some more bullet points here to share with you. He talks a lot about the AAWSAP and AATIP programs. This is very, very important. He makes it clear that, right from the beginning in 2017, when we learned about them, that there was a lot of confusion as to how they were reported. Some of this was understandable, but nevertheless, he wants to correct that. So AAWSAP stands for the Advanced Aerospace Weapon System Applications Program. That is a mouthful, as opposed to the AATIP program, which is the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. So both of them are Pentagon initiatives. You could say both of them are focused on investigating UFOs or UAP, but they're different. They have very different, distinct differences in their scope and their focus, how they even operate. So with AAWSAP, that starts first from an initiative from Senator Harry Reid in 2007. AAWSAP starts really in 2008. It's a much broader program, or it was a much broader program than AATIP. It really delved into what they would call unusual phenomena. You're really talking about an investigation of the Skinwalker Ranch. This was led by James Lukatsky and also Jay Stratton. The impression you get from reading Lou's book is that James Lukatsky was really the one absolutely focused on understanding the Skinwalker Ranch. People who've watched the show Skinwalker understand there's a lot of strange things, allegedly and measurably. Apparently, that has happened there. This is an old story. George Knapp and Colm Kelleher wrote A Hunt for the Skinwalker back in the 1990s. This was the ranch, of course, owned by Robert Bigelow for many, many years. It's now owned by Brandon Fugel, and was subject to a lot of research and investigation back in the 90s and beyond. And so what you really see is that the AAWSAP program in many ways was a continuation of Bigelow's research of this through the National Institute for Discovery Science, NIDS. You really see that, and I think Lou makes this quite clear in the book. It's a fascinating phenomenon to study, this particular piece of property. What he points out is that this was a very vulnerable program within the context of the Pentagon, and you could understand why, particularly in the George W. Bush years. It's still in the global war on terror being discussed, and you're going to investigate the paranormal at this place where there's portals and who knows what else is going on, ghosts. It was difficult, and there were always detractors within the Pentagon that were really trying to take this program out. He makes that clear. But it was very fascinating. Everyone who was involved, I think, recognized that the AAWSAP program was extremely intriguing and worth study, but it just found a greater and greater amount of internal opposition. Started out with a fair amount of support. It was within the Defense Intelligence Agency. One thing Lou does not discuss enough in this book that I would like to get clarification on is there appears to be a change in policy from the initial support of AAWSAP and perhaps even AATIP at the end of 2008, 2009. But then that begins to wane. And, of course, as we remember, that's a change of presidential administrations as well. It's January 2009 when the Obama administration comes into power. And although Lou doesn't really make this explicit, I found myself wondering more than once if the increasing levels of opposition that AAWSAP and then AATIP also, but especially AAWSAP, were getting from within the bureaucracy, did that have anything to do with the new presidential administration? This is a question that is not really addressed, and I don't know if there was a reason that it wasn't addressed or just an oversight. Could easily be an oversight, but I'm curious about it. But the reality is, what he points out is that the AAWSAP program, it studied all of these very fascinating things. He talks about the hitchhiker effect, the phenomenon of people who would go to Skinwalker Ranch and then leave, but whatever strange things were happening there would follow them to their home. This has been much discussed by a lot of the people who have been involved there. Lou does talk about that. And, a lot of other interesting things about Skinwalker. He doesn't get into a lot of the details, but you get the idea that this was a very important part of what AAWSAP was about. So out of that, Lou gets called, he says, in 2009 to be part of this team, which evolved into something a little more focused specifically on UFOs or UAPs. Apparently, they were being called UAPs. Increasingly, he points out that Jay Stratton really specifically tried to bring that phrase into the mix within their program. And all of this, he said, was as a way to kind of protect the program. UAP sounded a lot less emotionally charged than UFO. Talking about UFOs in the Pentagon, he's saying, look, there's a lot of resistance that we would get. So we tried to make this as milquetoasty and as objective sounding and not as emotionally charged as possible. And so UAP, they felt, worked. But the idea of moving away from AAWSAP to something like AATIP was essentially a more focused mandate, specifically on UAP. And within the Pentagon, and this is an important point here, if you're going to get the Pentagon to support this type of study, you're going to be a lot better off if you are focusing on any potential threats of these objects, particularly within the context of the global war on terror, but really in any context within the Pentagon. You've got a very competitive bureaucracy. Everyone wants the money that's in there. They're all fighting over it. And if you do not have a clear, tangible program with very specific objectives and outcomes that you're trying to get out of this, then you're going to be in real trouble. So the idea was, let's focus also on these UAP. And, in fairness, it was not difficult to see these as potential national security risks. As I will discuss and as Lou gets into in his book, they were looking at many, many cases where these objects were interacting with U.S. military personnel, Navy fleets in particular. Talks about the Tic Tac encounter, the Nimitz battle group, and then also later with the USS Roosevelt, demonstrating that these objects were absolutely well beyond capabilities that the United States had any noticeable or any potential ability to match in these things. So the idea was to emphasize the need to bring the program under a kind of national security umbrella to defend its existence within the Pentagon. And that was really a big part of what AATIP was about, the way he puts it. Again, you have people within the UFO, UAP community today who have issues with this so-called threat narrative. Again, I'm going to discuss that before we're done. But despite this, the mission of AATIP was to ensure that the phenomenon was taken seriously by the military and by the government. I think that's fair enough to say. And, the thing about Lou's position on this, it always strikes me as odd when people complain that a military guy is stressing a potential threat. This is what we pay them for. Like, you pay the military to defend your national security. That is the exact point of the military. And so it just always struck me as a little odd to complain that you got a guy coming out of that whole community who talks about a potential threat and then people want to complain that he's doing that. That's literally his job. Unless you just deny the need to have a military, which some people might do. But if you're going to have a military, you ought to expect that it's going to be looking for threats. And that is what Luis Elizondo does. So, you know, I absolutely am quite certain that he comes by this opinion honestly. This is his genuine opinion, that these things are a potential threat. So, and within that context, his mission has been to have this phenomenon studied and to get the military and the government to take it seriously. So he goes on, he really talks about how for almost the entire time that they were there, that the programs, AATIP and AAWSAP, were essentially under siege throughout their entire existence. As I said earlier, as he mentioned, they initially did enjoy some support from the DIA leadership, but over time, you see there's an increasingly number of detractors that emerge at very senior levels within the DIA. The program went from being initially favored to being what he called, I think, the Wicked Witch of the West, almost overnight. And again, I really wondered about the significance of going from the Bush presidency to the Obama years. Again, he doesn't deal with that. I would like to learn more about it, but he definitely gets into the fact that the higher ups were actively trying to kill the program, filing away or ignoring reports that were destined for other people in power, a lot of internal opposition, a lack of resources to deal with what he felt was a serious national security threat. And then he talks about the two particularly powerful forces in the way of the program. He talks about the Collins elite. These are essentially religious, Christian religious fundamentalists within the military who had a lot of power to shape policy within the DoD. This was written about by Nick Redfern, a researcher, a number of years ago. Lou actually states in the book, he said, I heard about this. I heard legends. He said, I thought it was like the Illuminati, this mystical thing that I don't really believe in. This is him. He says, no, actually, they turned out to be entirely, this was real. And then the other force that they had to deal with was what we can call the legacy program. That would be the secret, very largely privatized crash retrieval program. Let's talk about the Collins elite first. He has a few interesting things to say about that. As I said, he had heard stories about this, and he's like, I don't really know that I believe it. He discovered that several of the group's members were former colleagues of him, and even a former supervisor of his was one of them. He said every action that they took was motivated by their religious beliefs. It's not really clear if this is a formal thing, if this is an informal group of people. But he actually talked about a conversation he had with the one senior official who seemed to represent the viewpoint. And he just said, look, these are demonic. There is no reason that you should be looking into these any further. He said, we already know what they are and where they come from. They are deceivers, demons, is what this person told Lou. And he wrote that in the book. So it's not really clear how powerful the Collins elite was or is, but according to the book, they are indeed a presence within the military, and that is definitely interesting. And then the other thing he talks about is a legacy program, which I want to pull up my slide here for that. He actually, he lists, as you can see here, a number of the corporations that he has identified as part of it. These are the corporations, essentially, defense contractors, aerospace contractors that over the years where technology and in some cases biological remains of non-humans have been retrieved from the crashes. The legacy program, as far as Lou could see from his time in AATIP, has been working for a long time. They are working, he says, at total cross purposes to AATIP or AAWSAP. They're very jealous of their prerogatives in accessing UFO tech and having UFO knowledge and science, really wanting a monopoly of that is really how he kind of portrays it. And he mentions the main corporations, Lockheed Martin, TRW, which got bought, I think, by McDonnell Douglas, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, Raytheon, BAE Systems, the Aerospace Corporation. He also mentions Monsanto, which later was purchased by Bayer, as probably being involved due to the biological studies. Monsanto is interesting, of course, because they are really the world leaders in genetically modifying foods, genetic research, highly sophisticated with them. And he paints them as being part, apparently part, let's just say, of this legacy program. So that I found very, very interesting. The existence of a program like this, obviously, this is something I've talked about for years. Lots of other people have talked about this for years. It would mean that you've got a very deep conspiracy. I think that's probably the best word we can use here within the United States government to keep the truth away from citizens. And that is exactly how Lou puts it. He adds, in addition to these corporations, he has a few things to say about the Air Force, which he believes has had historic control over crash retrievals and leverage with the defense contractors in the legacy program. At one point, he says, nothing is more black than the legacy program. Nothing is more secret, in other words, than this program. I would say his discussion of these two groups, that is the Collins Elite and the legacy program, specifically the legacy program, are extremely important parts of this book. It brings up a bunch of other problems. I don't have slides for these, but I'll just mention here. Funding was a constant challenge. He said, he mentioned on one occasion there was $10 million in new funding that actually was secured. They were really excited about this, and it was almost immediately diverted to another DoD program due to the fact that the language that they had to use for their program was just very ambiguous in the funding, because they were trying to hide the fact that this had to do with UFOs. And another program apparently knew exactly what was going on there, and they said, oh, we can take this money. And they did. It's a real dog-eat-dog world within that whole community, and he could just points it out how they got screwed out of $10 million. Not necessarily a lot of money for many programs, but for them, it would have been just fine. He talks a number of times about the reluctance from U.S. government officials to want to acknowledge the existence of these UAP, just preferring not to discuss a threat for which they had no solution. He brings this up a number of times. That is the military attitude, is like, look, don't give me a problem unless you have a solution to it. And the fact was there wasn't any ready available solution to these UAP incursions. So, he talks a lot about the resistance he encountered when trying to brief higher ups, including Secretary of Defense James Mattis, with whom he had a prior professional relationship. He really was not ever able to discuss the program's findings with him. He talked a lot about the stigma and bias within the government, really just making it challenging for the group to pursue their investigations openly at all. He has a lot to say about the Nimitz encounter. That is the famous Tic Tac UFO encounter. Let me talk a little bit about that. It's very fascinating. He had a lot of specific data about this. This occurred in November of 2004, involving the USS Nimitz carrier strike group. A lot of this is already very well known, but he brings in an interesting perspective. He talks about how for 2 weeks leading up to the incident, radar operators aboard the USS Princeton had logged over 100 UAP activities in the air surrounding the vessels over not even quite 2 weeks. The objects were observed dropping from 80,000 feet to 50 feet in a fraction of a second and then going right back up. In fact, at one point he talked about, and this has also been discussed, I know elsewhere, but the amount of energy estimated to be involved to power just those types of instant accelerations that we're seeing. And I didn't write this down, but he has it in there as 1.1 trillion gigahertz, terawatts. I don't actually remember, terawatts perhaps. Massive amount. He said, look, this is enough to fuel all energy in the United States for years and years, just doing this one maneuver. An incredible. I don't know how that's estimated, but I'll just take their word for it. He puts that in the book. He does say on the day of the main encounter, you had 14 of these objects that were spotted in the training area that was designated solely for military maneuvers. Discusses the 2 Navy FA-18 Super Hornets. We all know about this. David Fravor commanding one, and Lieutenant Commander Jim Slate were in one. They observed a bizarre object. The Tic Tac's 46 feet long. He puts in there, shaped like an elongated oval, basically. Just going back and forth over the white caps about 50 feet above the water. He did not mention the claims of an object below the water at that time. I have heard these claims. They have been disputed, in fairness, but I tend to think that they are true. Lou doesn't get into that part of it. He does have a lot to say about USOs, which he certainly believes, but he just doesn't mention them here. The point is that as Fravor and Slate approached, he talks about how the object kind of rose up, shot off, disappeared within a split second. And then moments later, the call comes in that the object was reported at their combat air patrol point. That's the cap point. 60 miles away. It got there almost instantly. They all came back. The other plane was piloted by a woman, Alex Dietrich. She's very well known at this point. They all came back. Another pilot, Chad Underwood, goes out to the cap point. He's the one who captured the video footage of the object using what's called a FLIR or AT-FLIR, so Advanced Targeted Forward-Looking Infrared Radar. And we've all seen this. And you can get a good look at it. This is apparently possibly the same object that Fravor saw. It's not white, of course. It's infrared, so it's going to look a little bit different. Lou points out this object exhibited no heat signature, no acoustic signature, and was capable of hypersonic speeds and instantaneous maneuvers. And of course, you don't see any wings on it. There's no air intake, no exhaust plume, no cockpit, nothing distinguishable on this at all. He mentions that Jay Stratton, who was, of course, part of the AATIP-AAWSAP team, did the real lion's share of the investigation of this incident. He wrote a detailed report even before Elizondo joined the team. What Lou points out here is that despite the incredible significance of this encounter, he said there's really no noticeable official follow-up when the pilots returned to the Nimitz. He said the whole incident was largely dismissed by the senior upper brass. The captain reportedly saying, well, you guys had fun with this. Let's get back to work now. Beyond a few questions from a NORAD investigator to Underwood, Lou said no other internal agency appears to have investigated this encounter. Kind of interesting. There have been claims of guys in suits coming in to obtain the information aboard the Princeton and maybe aboard the Nimitz. So I think there's some dispute here as to what happened. But I think it's probably fair to say that you've got, we talked about the pilots being interviewed years after the fact. People did not want to go on the record. They didn't want their names down. There was a major clamping down of information on this. And, Elizondo's looking at this thinking, what the hell is going on? You have this incredible incident and no one seems to be talking about it. What is wrong with this picture? It's one of those things when he comes out into the public in 2017, I distinctly recall the very first statement of his that I remembered reading that really sunk in with me. He said something to the effect of, look at these reports, and if we had ever thought that the Chinese or Russians were behind these technologies, that it would cause a kind of pandemonium within the military. But he said, instead, all I hear is nothing but crickets. And I think this is what he's referring to, the reaction to the Tic Tac encounter, I think is the main trigger to that reaction by Lou Elizondo. He talks about the incidents dealing with the USS Roosevelt from late 2014 to early 2015. This, of course, was written about in the New York Times article a few years ago by Leslie Kane and Ralph Blumenthal. But Lou has a few other bits of information to say about it. Of course, if you don't remember, these all took place off in the waters off Virginia and actually all the way down to Florida. He mentions that during this period of time, he doesn't give the exact dates, but 2014 into early 2015, that the crew had 22 separate encounters with UAP during this period. And that's interesting because in the New York Times article, when that came out a few years ago, the number was stated as much higher, actually as much as several hundred. So he's correcting it or changing it to 22. Not sure what caused that discrepancy, but he's got 22. Still quite significant. He describes these as mostly small, initially assumed, I think, to be drones or probes from a classified U.S. military program. There is no indication in any of this book that anyone thought this was the Russians or the Chinese. I don't think anyone had an inkling that that would have been possible. And certainly that does not come out in his book. But there was, speculation. Is this something that we're doing secretly? He concludes highly unlikely to probably absolutely not. He gives, I think, some pretty good reasons for that. But then just talking about the capabilities of the objects that we're seeing, they could change elevations, very much like the Tic Tac UFOs on the West Coast. These objects could change their elevation from like 30,000 feet down to sea level instantaneously, stop in midair, and then shoot away in different directions. So showing all of the capabilities that you get with the Tic Tac on the other side of the country. Most of these, or at least some of them, maybe most, were small, like beach ball size, but others were significantly larger. He doesn't get into how large they attained, but they were apparently larger. He did state, this is off the East Coast, that there was at least one instance of a luminous underwater craft with some kind of eerie green glow following the ships. And then in another instance, and this was written about in the New York Times, Ryan Graves has talked about this as well. In one instance, an object flew right between two hornets flying in a tight formation, as Lou puts it, splitting their formation. And he discussed the incident in which you have basically a transparent orb or a sphere with a cube inside, and the 4 points of the cube touching the inner circumference of the sphere. This was, of course, described in the New York Times piece a number of years ago. Lou brings it up here in Imminent. Talks about a few other things about whether it was this object or other objects like it. I think really the latter, other objects like this. They demonstrated a very, very exceptional ability to stay in the air for a long, long time without refueling or apparently recharging. Like even 12 hours is a long period of time for a drone like this. These objects were up there for that long and maybe even longer. No one was really able to understand, like, what is this? And he also pointed out, he said, look, within the classified world, if you're going to test this technology, you are going to let other bodies that need to know that you're doing this test. It's important. This is like we don't, as a rule, do this type of thing and just test without other important, people knowing about it. In fact, he said it got to be such a bad problem for the flyers connected to the Roosevelt that they filed numerous safety reports in the hopes of sparking some kind of investigation. So a bunch of reports were filed through the Navy in various operating areas worldwide during this period as well. He talked a little bit about that. And in fact, he actually mentioned at one point you had senior intelligence officer at Fleet Forces Command reaching out to Jay Stratton of AATIP about these incidents, just trying to get some handle on it. So that was interesting. And actually one of the most interesting, this is a completely new thing for me. I had not heard this at all. We all know about the gimbal video, which was taken at around this time. But this was done in connection to something called Oplan Interloper. And this was a plan. And this is, unless I just misread it, but I think this was very much one of the things that Lou was involved in coming up with. I don't think he was alone in coming up with this, but the idea was to lure these UAP out of hiding over to the open sea so that they could be recorded and measured. In other words, to get them, kind of not trap them so they couldn't get away, but get them in the area so that you could then record them. So it involved using two things that he stated that these UAP are interested in: nukes and water. So the plan involved using nuclear powered or nuclear armed Navy ships. He doesn't really get into the details except to say that these Navy ships had nuclear components to them. He said we just brought them all out onto the water at once to see if we could bring in these craft. They tried to assign what was called an ACCM, that's an alternative compensatory control measures designation, to the plan. This was rejected, but the thing went ahead anyway. It's not all the details were clear to me. The CIA was involved in this. Other agencies were also involved, but apparently it succeeded. And one of the results is the gimbal video, which I've got a screenshot of it here. Everyone has seen this. He had a lot to say about the gimbal video too, in terms of trying to understand it. It really had a lot of extraordinary capabilities, and you see the glow around it, and that he connected that potentially to, let's say, the space-time field around it, which is the next thing that I want to talk about. This is Hal Puthoff, of course, who is really one of the most important people, other than Lou, in this book. Hal Puthoff really has a lot to do with this book. He comes up a lot throughout this book. I have personally known Hal Puthoff for more than 20 years. But a lot of the things that are in this book were not things that I personally got from Hal, not explicitly necessarily. Hal, in the book, confirmed to Lou that the Roswell incident in 1947 was real and that it did involve the recovery of a crashed UFO or UAP or flying saucer. He stated that there were 4 deceased non-human bodies that were recovered from that crash. He suggested, this is very interesting, that an electromagnetic pulse, or an EMP, may have inadvertently interfered with the UFO or UAP technology, which may have caused it to crash. And that actually isn't necessarily impossible. EMPs can disrupt all kinds of electronics. Maybe that is a possibility. Puthoff, as a result, theorized that if the Roswell craft was downed by an EMP by accident, it could mean that they have a kind of Achilles heel, at least potentially functioning similar to modern aircraft and motor vehicles in terms of being vulnerable to directed energy sources. In the book, Lou also mentions that Hal Puthoff conceived and commissioned fascinating studies for the AAWSAP or AATIP program, including these are the 38 Defense Intelligence Research Documents, or DIRDs, topics on things like invisibility cloaking and traversable wormholes and stargates and anti-gravity and brain-machine interfaces and warp drives and all of that. That was all Hal Puthoff's brainchild. This is something that Hal Puthoff himself did mention publicly in a lecture from a number of years ago. So it's all been out there. Lou just kind of brings it up again. But then most importantly, at least in my opinion, most interestingly, Lou discusses how, I don't really have a year for this, but I'm guessing around 2014, 2015 would seem about right, how Puthoff brings a bunch of the AATIP people into a skiff, and he essentially gives an extended lecture for them on how the so-called 6 observables of UAP, instant acceleration and transmedium capability and low observability, hypersonic speed without signature, positive lift or anti-gravity, and then the 6th one being biological effects. What Puthoff apparently said to them, he says that all 6 of these observables are explainable by essentially space-time management or space-time engineering. In other words, that the UFO or UAP technology manipulates the fabric of space-time itself in order to achieve what seems to be impossible, but actually is not impossible. And he does this. It's very interesting. Do I have a slide for this? I don't. I'll get to the biological effects in a second, but I just want to spend a little more time with this. So in terms of instantaneous acceleration and hypersonic velocities, he basically said, this is right out of Lou's book, by manipulating space-time around the craft, that these UAPs could potentially create a bubble of distorted space-time. So this bubble could allow the craft to move at incredible speeds without experiencing the effects of inertia or creating a sonic boom. Low observability, he also said, could be explained by space-time management due to its ability to bend or potentially bend light around the craft, which would make it appear either invisible or maybe distorted to observers. And this would also count for electronic detection like radar and things like radar, where you're sending a signal, you're bouncing it back, but it gets distorted when you're hitting the kind of envelope or the shield of the space-time bubble. Transmedium travel, same kind of thing. By manipulating space-time, the craft could potentially move seamlessly between different mediums, whether like air, water, space, without experiencing the usual resistance or limitations. And also with positive lift without wings. Like in a distorted space-time field, the craft might not need traditional aerodynamic surfaces to achieve lift. So, if you're doing also like a high-speed maneuver, same kind of thing. You're within the bubble, and anything inside the craft, if it's beings or anything else, would be protected from the effects of high acceleration if they were within that bubble. And then the biological effects, I will just mention that a little more detail. Lou gets into biological effects quite a lot in this book. Puthoff actually does state also that the biological effects that were reported could also be explained as a consequence of the intense manipulation of the local space-time field. Distorting space-time around the object would create zones of altered physical laws that could have unpredictable and potentially harmful effects on biological organisms. Lou, in his book, as I've got these bullets here, he just points out at many points in the book that these UAP encounters would cause injuries or often even deaths among military and intelligence personnel. It's worth pointing out that most of this, I don't really think, has come to light in the public. We heard David Grush talk this way a year ago before Congress, stating that people have died in some cases as a result of exposure to this technology. Lou is saying the same thing here. No one gets into specifics, but you got 2 people making this claim. That the effects resemble directed energy exposure. He talks a bit about orbs, actually quite a lot about orbs, that they are particularly associated with dangerous biological effects. In particular, he points out blue orbs as being the most dangerous. He actually talks about how he and his family began encountering orbs in their home. He was very explicit and quite adamant about his description of that, and I just found that quite interesting. And then finally, he's just saying even staff, people investigating this, often suffered various types of injuries as a result of their engagement with this phenomenon in one way or another. So there you go. And just back to Puthoff's ideas here, is essentially by manipulating the fabric of space-time itself, he's just saying UAP technology could theoretically achieve all of these seemingly impossible feats without violating the laws of physics as we understand them. So I thought that was a very interesting addition to the book. So what else? I mentioned he's describing basically the attacks on the program from within the Pentagon, but then he talks quite a bit about the attacks on him personally from various sources within the Pentagon. He talked about, without mentioning the name Kona Blue, he's clearly talking about that. We learned about the Kona Blue program earlier this year. This was basically a failed attempt to get the AATIP program out of the DIA, where it had become a very vulnerable and you could almost say unwelcome program. So this is very interesting. So Lou was talking about this. He says, look, by this time, my own clearances were very, very significant. And he said, I was able to get this program under my purview, essentially, if I could take it out of the DIA. And they tried to do that. They looked at Homeland Security. They looked at other departments. None of those worked. And he does not mention Kona Blue by name in the book, but I'm pretty darn sure that's what he is talking about, because it really does fit perfectly. Like, it's like we had to get the program out of DIA. It just was not going anywhere, and we needed to do that. Just how the program functioned between 2012 and 2017 wasn't precisely clear to me while I was reading this. I'm not saying he was trying to be sketchy or hazy here, but it just was not super clear to me. But what was definitely evident was that you had Lou, you had Jay Stratton, you had Hal Puthoff, and there was a number of other people, not all of whom were mentioned. Some of whom were. He mentions Eric Davis a number of times by name. He does not mention Dr. Kit Green explicitly, but he does mention him through a pseudonym. It's very obvious. He's talking about Dr. Kit Green, just not that by that name. And there's a lot of other people who were deeply involved. Gary Nolan comes up a lot in this as well. So there's a number of like very highly brilliant, qualified people who are clearly involved. The bureaucratic structure of this was, I'm not a Pentagon insider. Maybe it's a little bit hard for me to get into the small ball of what's going on with the Pentagon. That would be nice if it were a little more clear to me. But that's a minor quibble on my part. He discusses the process by which he tried to get the 3 videos declassified. I found that very interesting. I won't go into all of the details here, but he certainly makes it obvious it was all above board by the book, and kind of lucky. He got kind of lucky with some of the permissions he was able to get. And I only mention it here because when those videos came out, there was talk, sometimes from within the Pentagon, that those videos were not properly declassified. And the fact was, he makes it very clear they were indeed properly declassified. He mentions the Wilson Davis memo in his book. I found that I'm always gratified to hear anyone talk about that. If you followed anything I've done over the last 5 years, I was involved in the discussion on this when those notes leaked out in 2019. And for a while there, I felt that I was the only voice with any following in the UFO field that was defending them. And it was very disappointing to me, I'll just say this here, to see how so many researchers ran away in terror from that document, and how many others actually seem to go out of their way to try to attack the documents and call them a hoax or some other nonsense. It's obvious now that an overwhelming consensus has formed to support the validity of these documents. I don't think there's any question about that. If you read Jacques Vallée's last volume of Forbidden Science, he's extremely explicit about it, as are many other sources. But here, Luis Elizondo also is, and he actually states about the notes that Eric Davis took. He said, Hal and Eric gave a copy of this memo to Dr. Edgar Mitchell. And it was from Mitchell's estate, of course, that we got those notes after he died in 2016, I believe that was, where they then eventually made it out to the rest of the world. But he talks very explicitly about the Wilson meeting. Of course, it started back in 1997 with Dr. Stephen Greer, with Dr. Edgar Mitchell, and Navy Commander Will Miller was involved, and a few other people, where they briefed met with a few people in Washington, including Admiral Thomas R. Wilson, arguing that that there was essentially rogue operations that involved U.S. defense contractors that had possession of crash retrieval wreckage, and that the security of the projects was beyond top secret. And of course, Wilson did look into that, was denied access to the program, and then 5 years later was able to meet with Davis, who interviewed him for 70 minutes in a car in Las Vegas and wrote those very detailed notes out, which we now have. One thing Lou did is he called Eric Davis's credibility as, quote, unimpeachable. That's typical for what you hear about Eric Davis. Everyone says this about him. Extremely honest individual. Lou did not claim that he had direct involvement or firsthand knowledge of the documents, of the Wilson Davis documents, but he is reporting on information that has come to him through the community that he is working within. So I thought that was very interesting. The fundamental message, do I have notes here for this? Let's see. Here we go. It's real. Someone is here. He occasionally uses the phrase friends from out of town. Why not? UFOs are real. They are, well, not human, alien. We have a significant program going back many years that operates in total secrecy. That's the Legacy program. There's tremendous opposition within the military and the government bureaucracy against revealing this information to the public. There's a great risk of a potential threat from these UAP. So let's talk about the threat narrative. People love to use that word narrative. I'll just say, anytime you hear the word narrative, you have to remember that that word itself is a rhetorical device. Anytime you hear the word narrative in a discussion, it's always meant to diminish an argument that you just happen to disagree with. This is the only time you ever hear narrative. There's a lot of other words that you could say. You could say position, you could say opinion, you could say argument. Those would all be a lot more neutral. But when you hear someone say narrative, you know that they're taking almost always an ideological position here. And I think that is absolutely true. When I hear people say, oh, he's bringing up the threat narrative, it essentially dismisses it as to something that's a mere unimportant, reflexive position that doesn't require or deserve any deep understanding or appreciation. I think that's a very dangerous position to take. I think it's a very misguided one. The first thing to say, though, here is that there is no question in my mind that Lou's position on potential UAP threat, he comes by it honestly. This is his opinion. And like his attitude, he actually has a quote here. It says, look, at best, this is a very serious national security issue. And at worst, he says the possibility of an existential threat to humanity. Now, you don't have to agree with that. And, depending on the day of the week, I may or may not agree with that myself. But he makes a few points to this. He emphasizes that these objects are routinely observed, performing maneuvers far beyond any known human technological capabilities. If you're a military guy, you're going to care about this. Again, this is what we pay them for. You pay your military to identify potential threats. It's disingenuous, it seems to me, to expect a military person to do anything other than that. So that's concerning. Just the potential of another agency, whether it's from Earth or not from Earth, to have these capabilities to just run circles around our top aircraft, that would be worrisome, would it not? He also notes, as have many other researchers, including myself, that these UAP have been observed interfering with nuclear capabilities, violating sensitive military airspace. Yeah, no shit. We all know this. It's been going on for decades, and he is making that statement himself. He describes incidents where these UAP come dangerously close to military aircraft, as we mentioned with the Roosevelt encounters, sometimes splitting formations, which for him, that's a little problematic, would it not be? Yes. He points out, you don't have to go all the way down this geopolitical analysis, but this is his take. He points out that if another country, China, Russia, some other nation were to get this technology that could be dangerous. Well, sure, it could be. From that perspective, you want to know, like, how are we on top of controlling and managing this technology? All of these are legitimate concerns. Of course, he doesn't bring up the concern that what would the United States do with this technology, but we'll leave that aside for now. He does mention that several military servicemen and intelligence officers succumbed to injuries and even lost their lives due to biological effects of these encounters. And one thing he said that was really quite interesting, I was not familiar with this line of thinking, but he suggested that all of this activity, even for the last 70, 80 plus years, could be interpreted as what he calls initial preparation of the battlefield. This is a known thing, IPB, an IPB operation. To him, that would be like the worst case scenario. In other words, they're here for like 80 years. They're testing our defenses. They're seeing, are we able to detect this? Can we stop this? Are we vulnerable to this technology and that? So all of that would be a kind of long-term testing of our capabilities. The reason I actually don't find that particularly persuasive is that our own capabilities have kind of leapfrogged over themselves over the last 80 years. But really what you see in human technological capability since, let's just start with the 1940s, has been one revolution after another. So in other words, our capabilities have not been stable. So preparation of the battlefield, maybe they are doing that, but you'd think if they were smart, they would have done their attack 80 years ago rather than now. We're moving along a lot better now. So, but anyway, it's a legitimate scenario from his point of view. Could there be some kind of invasion? Well, this is something he brings up. And by the way, he's also points out that, we humans could easily be considered the threat to them. He makes his point very clearly, which of course, no kidding. It's quite obvious. We're very, let's put it mildly, an assertive species with access to some pretty increasingly good weaponry. Yeah, we like to throw our weight around. I've speculated on this matter many, many times myself. And, I'll often just say to myself, like, would any extraterrestrial intelligence that comes from another world, would they be radically different from us in the sense that they, like us, have goals and plans, desires, an end game when they see a world as amazing as Earth and a species as interesting and maybe frightening as humanity? Would they just be neutral to all of that, or would they have their own goals? Well, I think it's certainly absolutely fair and on the table to ask that question and to speculate as to whether or not we are able to understand their motives and what they might be interested in doing. So, is he right? Is he right about them being a threat? I mean, we don't really know that. We don't know for sure, but could he be right? I would say yes, he absolutely could be right. There's one thing I will just point out where I will disagree. And he made this point, and I'm not sure that I agree with this either. So on the one hand, you have people saying, well, there's we're foolish to assume that they are not potentially dangerous. And I agree with that. But I would also say that the other side of the argument is often kind of weak too. I often hear this, and he said this, which was that, well, if they really are so good, they haven't really helped us out very much, have they? And maybe that's true, but I don't think that's a very good argument to say that, like, if they're benevolent and they haven't helped us, why haven't they helped us if they're benevolent? I think that's actually a weak argument. I mean, you have to ask yourself, how could a benevolent species come down to our world? What would they do to stop us from killing each other, from destroying the global ecosystem, from doing all the other horrible things that we do? Would they come down and just lay down the law and like completely obliterate our culture and society? Seems to me that would really be one of the only ways they could do it. We're not an easy species to just collectively kind of organize. I could see this as being a very difficult thing for any outside intelligence just to come in and say, yeah, we're going to fix you. We may not be that easy to fix. I'm just saying. So I think, the fact that an alien race has not just fixed us, that is not necessarily a good argument to say that, well, they're probably not very good. You know, why haven't they helped us? Well, it may be more difficult than that. So, but yet the argument that says, you know, the threat analysis, he's just doing a threat narrative. I do think that there's a lot of naive and utopian elements to the people who criticize anything that sounds like a threat. It's like, well, you're just running to the national security apparatus. You're running to the military. You're running to the CIA. No, no, and no. And, you know, for me to say this, I'm very critical. I am incredibly critical of many things that the United States government and military and intelligence community do. If you followed me at all, you know this. But the idea that aliens must be good because they haven't harmed us yet, that's the other side of that thing. And that's equally naive and I think ultimately quite foolish. Just because aliens have not openly attacked or harmed us that we can see overtly doesn't mean that they are benevolent. Their motives could be very long-term and unknown to us. There's a lot of mistaken assumptions that, you know, all of us are able to make at one point or another. And I would just say we have reason to think one possibility, we have reason to think another possibility, and we really need to keep our mind open on this and not to condemn people simply because they come to a different opinion on this than you do. So I would just say that. Before I wrap this up, I'll just mention he has one really fascinating story. It's not really related to AATIP, but it has to do with an M1 Abrams tank, which is from 2003. He was assigned as a special agent in Kuwait, special agent in charge, a SAC in Kuwait. And he encounters this strange incident involving a couple of M1 Abrams tanks. So an NCO calls him and says, look, you got to come here. Look at this. I can't talk to you about this. He comes and he drives out and he shows him a very peculiar hole in one of the tanks. The hole goes straight through the body of the tank, out the other side, as if, he says, someone had used a sharp cookie cutter to take a core sample of the vehicle. And what was really remarkable, I mean, the M1 tank is considered the crown jewel of the American field arsenal. I mean, it's designed to take a direct hit from a missile and to survive such a hit. And the sides in the front are the most heavily armored sections of the tank. And, you know, he points out the energy required to create a hole like this would have been enormous. By the way, the tanks were not in a battle situation. They were actually just in a, they were being stored somewhere, and there were two of them next to each other. So one tank had the hole through it. And then he said the tank next to it also showed precisely the same type of damage. It had one clean hole going through the sides of both of these tanks. It's insane. He mentioned there had been a goat herder, a Bedouin goat herder who had been tending his flock at night, reported seeing some kind of brilliant green flash in the night sky directly over the tanks. Is that related or not? We don't know. He did point out that the tanks were sent pardon me, to the Yuma Proving Ground in Arizona for analysis. He'd never learned what the findings were of that analysis, but that's a heck of a story. Just thought I'd mention it. So I'm going to wrap this up here. I will just say there's much more in the book than even what I have discussed here, and I've tried to really hit a lot of the main points, but there's so much more. If you are a student of the subject, it's definitely worth your read, and for many of you, it's worth taking careful notes. I'm glad this book is out. I have no doubt that there are going to be detractors out there beyond even those who don't like the so-called threat narrative. I'm not going to care to speculate on their motives. What I will say in closing is this. Back in 2008, 2009, 2010, thereabouts, the very period when AAWSAP and AATIP were engaging in their investigations of the weird, when they were under attack from the Pentagon bureaucracy and from competitors like the Legacy program, there are many of us in the UFO research community. We would often talk about how it would be wonderful if some insider with real deep knowledge were to come out and reveal what they knew about all this. Well, there was such a person at that very time. His name was Luis Elizondo. And when he finally did come out with this information in 2017, and ever since, it's been good that he has received some support. Yeah, but my goodness, the number of rotten eggs thrown at him from the very community one would have thought would support him. That's been an astonishing thing to see. Small wonder why many of the folks in those circles developed a contempt for much of that community. Last thing I'll just ask is where is all this going to go? And that's, I think, hard to say. This book is a definite statement. It's not just for the general public. It's not just for the UAP researchers. It is for government people. It is for members of Congress. It is for decision makers. There is no question this book is being read and discussed in those circles. I believe Lou when he says he wants to end the secrecy on this subject. I've spoken with him directly. I'm quite sure he means it all. And he's also committed, however, to maintaining the security oaths that he's taken. And you can see he's trying to thread that needle as carefully as he can. That is, he's trying to tell the truth while maintaining himself legally. From my perspective, where I'm standing here, I think he's done a very good job with that. Because that cannot be an easy thing to do. And he actually describes a lot of that within the context of the book. Aside from positioning the UFO or UAP subject to people within the military and Congress in such a way as to get positive action from them about it, you think about how difficult that would be. And that is also something he really talked about. Now, he had help in that. People like Chris Mellon immediately come to mind. Been very helpful, and there's a lot said about Mellon's contributions to this. But Lou has done a lot. I mean, my personal feeling is that those of us who care about UFO or UAP truth owe him a lot for his contributions, and this book now being an important one. Well, that's all I got for you on this for today. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please like, subscribe, and share. Also, visit my website at richardolanmembers.com. It's a great community with great people there. I will be back again with you for more. Until then, let's keep fighting the good fight. Catch you later.